Imagine your car starts making a funny noise, so you take it to the mechanic shop, only to be greeted by an expensive repair bill. Maybe your car doesn't actually need an expensive repair. It's very common for mechanic shops to scam people or charge them for expensive repairs that aren't really necessary. With a basic understanding of how your engine works, you could prevent a scam like this and maybe even fix the car on your own. So, I think this topic is really relevant to everyone that's over the age of 16 at least, because most of the people I know are driving to get to their destinations, and at some point you're gonna have vehicle trouble, and I think it would be helpful to understand how the engine works so maybe you could fix it or get it to a shop without a tow truck, which is just extra charges on top of having to get your car fixed. So, um, I wouldn't say I'm the most credible to speak on this topic, but I think I have some credibility. I've always liked to drive cooler cars that I couldn't afford, so I end up getting older cars that might need some work, and that's given me a little bit of experience working on engines and kind of understanding how they work. So, um, the purpose of this speech is just to help you understand how engines turn fuel into power and maybe just have a better understanding of that process. So, first, I'm going to explain all the components that are involved in making the engine work, or the most important components, and then I'm going to go into explaining how the engine actually works with those components. Some of the pieces may sound a little bit complex or might not make a lot of sense, but once I get farther into the explanation, I think some things will start adding up. Um, so I'm going to pull up my diagram here for the parts of the engine. I think that'll help kind of explain what's going on. One sec. I'm not sure how well you can see that. It kind of messes up the lighting. That's why I waited to pull it up. But the first most important part, in my opinion, is going to be the engine block. And that's really just the main housing that holds all of these other components together. And that is going to be, I don't know how well you can see the diagram, but there's kind of a gray area right here. And that's going to be what separates the block from the engine head, which is this area above. And the the engine block houses things like the pistons, the connecting rods, and the camshaft, which I'll explain in 1 second. And then the head houses things like the valves, spark plugs, and fuel injectors. So the next thing I'll talk about is the pistons. So I think that's the next most important thing. Um, you can see right here, these four things will be the pistons. And this is a four-cylinder engine, so you're going to have four pistons. You might have heard the term V8, and that stands for an 8-cylinder engine, which would have 8 pistons. So the pistons have a connecting rod, which connects them. That's this piece right here. The piston is the round part, and then you have the connecting rod, which connects it to the camshaft. So the pistons are what moves up and down to generate force, and then the camshaft works with all of the pistons together to turn that up and down force into a rotational force that can then be used to move the car. So from there, I'm going to talk about the valves, which also play a key role. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a spring on each of the valves. You have four valves per piston. So two of those valves are going to be an intake valve for oxygen, and then two of those valves are going to be an exhaust valve. So another important part that isn't going to be in this example because it would be in the rear of the car typically would be the fuel pump. This is connected to your fuel tank and it sends fuel from the tank to the engine. sends the fuel specifically to the fuel injectors. Those are typically located in the head of the engine on the top, and they inject the fuel into the engine, and this is what creates the combination of the intake valve and the injectors make the air to fuel ratio that makes the car run. So you also have spark plugs that are typically located on the side of the block right here or on the top in the head sometimes. The spark plugs are what ignites that fuel and air mixture to create the combustion. So you also have a starter, which is a key component to the engine, and it's not going to be in this example, but that would typically be located on this. This is going to be your torque converter, which connects to your transmission. The starter rotates that torque converter to get the engine started. So that just helps get the process started. Most people would be familiar with a lawnmower, how it has a pull cord. This starter is the electric version of the pull cord, but it's for your car. So the next most important feature, I think, is the battery, because that actually powers that starter and it powers the spark plugs, which are two key things to start the car and run the car. The battery also powers all your electronics like lights and windows and things like that, so it's very important. The next key component is going to be the alternator, and that's going to be on the front of the engine right here, hooked up with a belt to the camshaft. So the camshaft spins that belt and it spins the alternator, and what that does is it generates electricity to charge the battery, so your battery doesn't die from using it to start the car and whatnot. So the last 13th key component of the engine is going to be the air intake, which isn't seen in this diagram, but you can see the diagram doesn't specify which side of the engine we're looking at. So really, these valves could be the intake or the exhaust valves, but either one, you get the idea. The air intake would direct air to those valves so that it can get into the engine. So those are just the 13 most important components in my personal opinion. There are definitely a long list of components that go into making the engine run, but I think to understand the basic process, that's all you need. So now I'm going to move on to what's actually happening to make combustion happen in the engine. So combustion is just kind of a fancy word for an explosion. And in the engine, that explosion is a mixture of fuel and air to create power. And it creates that power by creating a tight space and exploding, so it pushes the piston down. And as a result of pushing that piston down, it rotates the camshaft to power the car, essentially. And you can see here, this isn't the best diagram, maybe it was the best one I could find, but the pistons work together, so while this one may be going down, that energy is pushing the next piston up, and they go in a very specific order so that they can work efficiently. So most engines commonly are a four-stroke, and this refers to the way that they operate, and it's a four-stroke pattern. I'm going to pull up an example of that really quick. So this will kind of make all the components of the engine make a little bit more sense. So you can see here we have the cylinder and the piston, and then we have the intake valve right there. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see here. The intake valve will open and allow air to come in to the cylinder, and that piston draws down and sucks the air in, and then you move on to your next step. So this is stroke number one, the intake stroke, and then you have stroke number two, which is the compression stroke. So the piston moves back up and compresses that air, and then the fuel is injected as well, and it compresses the air and fuel together to then be on step number three, the power stroke. The fuel and air are then ignited, which pushes the piston back down. That's why it's called the power stroke. So to complete the four-stroke series, we have the exhaust stroke, which is the piston going back up and opening the exhaust valve and pushing that burnt mixture out of the cylinder. So now you understand why it's called a four-stroke motor. So now that you understand how the engine creates power, I want to explain how it delivers the power to the wheels. So the engine, the combustion powers the pistons, and the pistons go up and down to rotate the camshaft. And then I'm going to pull up my example. The camshaft rotates, that rotates the torque converter, that rotates your transmission. The transmission goes down the line to your wheels and makes the car work. Transmissions are a lot more complicated than the engine, in my opinion. It's a series of complex gears that work with the engine to give a proportionate amount of power depending on how fast you're going. So let me go ahead. Thinking about turning that off, but I might need to use it in the future, so I'm going to keep it on. So I highly recommend you to get on it. If you're interested in this topic, get on YouTube and search how do engines work. You'll see a video that kind of looks like this diagram. I think he did a very good job of explaining it, a little bit better than me maybe, but I've done my best, and I hope if you ever have car troubles that you can remember something from this speech that might help you out.